In this video, we will show you how to replace your front lower control arm on this Ford F-150. This is part of your front steering and suspension, located inside of your front wheel well. Let's get into it. Okay friend, let's get started on our job. The first thing we have to do is safely raise and support the front of the vehicle so the suspension's hanging and the wheel's off the ground. Continuing on, we're going to remove the wheel by removing all 6 of our 21mm lug nuts, and we can get this off of here. Now with the wheel out of the way, we're making our way underneath our forward lower control arm. In this area, you're going to find the shaft for your front sway bar link, making its way down and through the control arm. The rest of it's up above, leading to your sway bar. We'll remove our 18mm headed mounting nut down along the bottom area here. When loosening this, you may find that the entire stud wants to spin on you. If that's the case, we'll be using an 18mm to hold on the mounting nut itself and an 8mm down on the shaft of the sway bar link. At that point, you can either turn the shaft of the sway bar link clockwise to start removing it while holding the nut, or you can turn the nut counterclockwise while holding the stud. Now we have movement from that sway bar link. Let's continue forward on the lower control arm, still remaining underneath it. We'll continue on to our 2 18mm headed mounting nuts, holding the front shock assembly to that lower control arm. Now we're moving along to where our lower ball joint is connected to our front steering knuckle. Down along the bottom here, you're going to find a 21mm headed mounting nut. We can remove this. Now that we have that ball joint nut off of there, a quick inspection will start it back on just a couple threads. We're going to have to continue on with some support underneath that lower control arm. We'll be making our way right along here. After applying support, we're going to pay attention to our mounting hardware, holding the control arm to the frame of the vehicle. You're going to find that you have a 21mm headed through bolt that makes its way through the frame, through the control arm, and out through the other side. On the other side, you're going to have an 1/16" mounting nut to remove. Before you start removing this hardware, let's make sure we make a clear marking on each side of the frame where the mounting bolts are located. On the frame itself, the port for the bolts are oblong, so we want to try to get the lower control arm into as close as the same position as possible. For this, I'm just using a crayon. You can use pretty much anything you have that can make a clear marking. Make our way right around here. Now I'll repeat the process on the other side. And the same for the rearward mounting bolt. After making our markings, we can continue on to the removal. Let's make sure we have movement here. Remove that mounting nut, a quick inspection. Same process for the rearward hardware. Now, if you found that the mounting bolt is stuck in position, you can try working it back and forth. Now that we have movement, we can remove our mounting nut. Now, while having support underneath the control arm, we'll continue on with driving out each one of our pieces of mounting hardware. We will be reusing these unless, of course, you do have a replacement. Be extremely careful not to damage any of the threaded portion of the mounting bolts. Use a hammer and punch if necessary. thorough inspection of the mounting bolt. As you can tell, there is some rust. If yours looks like it's rotted to the point that it needs to be replaced, you do want to make sure you have a replacement. I'll clean this up, set it aside. Now, as you can tell, the front control arm has shifted a little bit here. Let's continue on removing our forward mounting bolt. Now, with each one of our two mounting bolts out of position, we can start lowering down the inboard side of the lower control arm. You can see it's starting to separate from the lower shock and from our sway bar link. Once you have the lower control arm lowered down as far as possible, we'll continue with some support underneath this area. Now let's make our way towards that lower ball joint mounting stud. We'll have to lightly tap on this, driving it up and out of position away from our steering knuckle. We'll remove support. We can start working this around a little bit, separating it. Continuing from here, we're going to have to pivot the lower control arm around, separating it from the lower aspect of your front shock assembly. The shock itself has two studs that protrude down. These are pressed in studs, so we're just going to make our way underneath the shock up above that lower control arm and gently pry the two apart. Get this nut off of here. Continuing on, we're going to lift up on the control arm, separating the ball joint stud from the steering knuckle. As we make our way up, you want to be extremely careful for your axle located just above this area. We'll pivot the control arm and remove it from the vehicle. There it is, friend. It's time to clean and inspect several areas. We'll start at the frame, where the control arm will mount to. We want to make sure we clean the inboard side here and thoroughly inspect to make sure nothing's rotted or damaged. Use a wire brush, some sandpaper, whatever you have. Continuing on, we have the studs for our front shock. Make our way over towards that sway bar link. Just make sure that boot's not torn. This looks good. Make our way to the knuckle where the ball joint stud will go through. Now let's install our control arm. We'll start with our ball joint stud directly into our steering knuckle. Once you have that in there, we'll continue on with our ball joint nut. Go ahead and start it on there a couple threads. Now we're going to have to pivot this into a position that we can install the lower studs for our front shock and the stud for our front sway bar link into the control arm. Get this up in here. All right. Let's continue on with some support underneath that control arm. Continuing on, we're going to bring this up into the position it aligns with the frame, and we'll have our two through bolts making their way from the front, in and through the frame, through the control arm, out through the other side. Now it looks as though the rearward port is starting to be aligned here. Let's go ahead and start putting in that mounting bolt. I've used some copper anti-seize on the shanked area there, cleaned up the threads, and we'll use some thread locker if necessary on those. Now that we have that bolt through there, we can focus on the forward mounting bolt. Now we can remove support from under this area and we'll continue on with our 2 mounting nuts. Now we can snug and torque the ball joint nut to 76 foot-pounds. Now we're going to have to apply upward pressure on the outer portion of our lower control arm so we can make our way to the inboard mounting bolts holding it to the frame. I'm going to use a spacer in between my jack here. We'll continue on bringing this up to the original ride height position and we'll make our way to those mounting bolts. Now since I already have my bolts in there, we can start on each of our 2 mounting nuts. There's that one, do the same to the other. Now we'll have to make our adjustment. We had markings, we want to try to get this aligned in that same area. Now since my control arm clearly has to move outward a little bit for the forward mounting hardware, I'm going to make my way up inside this area and gently pry it into the area that it needs to be. And then we'll continue on by holding the bolt head and tightening the rearward nut. Right about there looks pretty good. Put this on there. Now we'll just double check our markings to make sure we're as close as possible to the original position. If it does need to be adjusted, go ahead and loosen that mounting nut, make your adjustment, re-snug it. After that, torque this to 258 foot-pounds. Now let's focus on the rear here. We already have our mounting nuts started on. We're going to try to get this into the right positioning so we can snug it up. Now in my case, my control arm is pulled too far outward, so this time I'm going to pull it inward. I'll just use a ratchet strap. You can use whatever works best for you. Just as before, confirm you have the proper alignment on both sides here, and we'll continue on with torquing this. The torque for this is the same as the front, 258 foot-pounds. I've made my confirmation. We can remove our ratchet strap, assuming you're using one. Continue on to the support from underneath the control arm. We'll carefully start lowering this down. Now we're making our way back underneath the lower control arm. It's time to start installing our hardware here. Let's start with the stud for our sway bar link. We'll start on our 18mm mounting nut. Now at this point, we're going to have to start tightening this up, but you may find that the stud of the sway bar link spins on you just as it did when we were trying to remove this. We'll try to get the nut up far enough that we can eventually grab onto the stud and continue tightening after that. There we are. Now that we have this snug, we'll torque it to 46 foot-pounds. Let's start on our lower mounting hardware here. We'll start it on, snug it up, torque that to 66 foot-pounds. Now it's time to install the wheel. We'll get this up in position, start on all the lug nuts. Once they're bottomed out, we'll get the wheel back on the ground and torque them to 150 foot-pounds. We'll be snugging and torquing in a crisscross manner. Get this on the ground. Torqued. Okay, friend, we've got our vehicle back together. At this point, you want to go ahead and take it for a road test, listen for any funny noises, get yourself safely down to your local alignment shop. Thanks for watching.
When only the best will do, demand TRQ. the only company that lets you view before you do. TRQ is committed to offering the highest quality aftermarket auto parts that are engineered for peace of mind. Thanks for using and viewing with TRQ.